You are the Director of Access and Policy at Elsevier. So what is your role and what are you meant to accomplish in this role?
Thanks for the invitation and for the chance to be here. The role has existed for about 5 years in Elsevier, and it is a role with a small team. We're responsible for open access strategy and policy, and also for making sure that any access gaps in the dissemination of our subscription content are identified and closed, and that's the Universal Access Program.
Universal Access Program, and what part of the company is that? Is it
that's a hard question to answer. You wouldn't think it would be. No. We move around a little bit. The group started out in the Central Strategy Department, and we've come to rest at the minute in research management. But we might move again, who knows? But the point is we work across all the business units, and we're not tied to any one particular part of the business.
Alicia, yesterday you spoke at a panel, and it was dealing with how facilitating of sharing among researchers. And one of the things you guys were looking at was the need for collaboration between libraries and publishers to make this happen properly and to have it done right. And I'm just wondering, what were the most impressive or the most thoughtful suggestions that came out of the session, and what were you suggesting yourself?
Thanks for that question. So it was a lively lunch session, and it was a small group. We had about 15 people there, I think, but a nice balance of librarians and publishers. And it was really well facilitated by Maggie Farrell at Clemson. Okay, sure. So we were talking about how to facilitate researchers in their sharing needs. We started out talking about all of the different systems that researchers use to share articles on campus. Right. You know, anything from the institutional repository to MOOCs and courseware management systems, Dropbox, email, the overwhelming favorite. And then we were talking about how to collaborate, and some of the challenges that we can work, I think, really effectively on together is making it much clearer for researchers that they can share with confidence on the platform of their choice by working together to make sure all of the licensing and the copyright implications are sorted out so they don't need to worry about it. And one of the ideas that came out was it was a request, an invitation for librarians to have a look at the STM Association's article sharing principles and give our community feedback about whether you find those mutually agreeable as kinds of rules of the road for facilitating article sharing.
You also were on a panel on text and data mining contracts, if I'm not mistaken. And there's been a little controversy around that, around some of it, and I'd like you to address that a little bit. And as far as Elsevier's point of view, what was the main message that you wanted to get across?
In the TDM session yesterday, it was that publishers, not only Elsevier, but across the spectrum in our community, we're all actively supporting researchers to do text and data mining, but it's still very much, I think, in the early adoption phase. Researchers are approaching TDM in different ways in different subject areas. We're all needing to invest in new systems and support procedures, just as libraries are. So if you see something that doesn't work quite right, doesn't look quite right, talk to your publisher. It's probably that they're working through some kinks and are willing to be responsive rather than them trying to make it complicated, which is a misperception sometimes, I think.
And the licensing, I think there has been some criticism about the licensing that's required by Elsevier. Is that a firm policy, or is that something that is also being, in the sense, of work in progress? Well,
all of our policies are reviewed periodically, but that one is stable at the minute. And let me explain why that we do licensing. We are supporting researchers around the globe. They are based in different institutions, in different states, in different countries. They all have different legal frameworks. So we just need an easy, light touch way that we can roll out text and data mining services to all of them. So we've got a simple clause that's being inserted in the Science Direct Site licenses. There's no additional cost. And then there's an easy click-through agreement for the individual API users.
So do individuals have to do this, or is this the libraries getting the license?
So the library is getting the clause and the license, but we do ask ask the individual users to do the click-through license. And the reason is, to do their mining, they are actually running code, software programs on our platforms, and we need them to just be sensitive to the fact that they need to be thoughtful and mindful about what that code is going to do, and we need a way to get in contact with them just in case their script doesn't work the way they had anticipated.
It's not an attempt to be restrictive, at least it's an attempt to...
It's enabling, it's intended to be enabling.
To clarify things as far as the coding, I see.
I wonder if you would, for everybody who's perhaps not clear what text and data mining is all about, it might be useful just to give an example of a project that involves text and data mining and how Elsevier might be involved with that.
Okay. There are lots of different approaches, but let me think of one specific example. A chemist might want to search across a very broad array of literature, not only from Elsevier, but from other publishers as well, to identify all of the bits of text that refer to a particular chemical compound, and they can do that. We are working in collaboration with other publishers through the Crossref service to give miners the chance to be able to identify which publisher platforms they need access to, and to be able to send their mining tools across our platforms.
And the end result of this search is what?
It can be different things. Sometimes the outputs are quantitative. They're counting the occurrences. Sometimes there's snippets of text, so maybe those chemical compounds in a sentence or two of context. Sometimes, for example, if it is a linguist doing the searching, maybe they need a larger chunk of text. There'll be nothing numeric at all. They're actually interested in the word in its context, to look at how meanings change over time, for example. Very broad array of outputs.
And so the output of such a search is not something you publish, it is something that becomes data for doing other research.
Well, it could be both, actually. Yeah. And that's, again, what we're working through. Because sometimes the data outputs, especially if they contain a lot of text and are to be republished or put on the web, that could potentially impinge on the subscription model or whatever for the journal. So we're all trying to figure this out.
I was going to say, it's very much a work in progress in that regard.
Yeah, that's right. We have I think it's a 200-word snippet limit now on the redisplay of outputs. But again, if a researcher finds that a barrier, we just encourage them to talk to us. We can be flexible.
Okay. Of the researchers who have actually gone through the process of licensing the capability of doing the mining, has anybody been turned down?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
What kind of problems have you run into? Have you run into problems with coding?
Well, sometimes, yeah. I think you have to have more programming skills than I personally have to be able to do text and data mining at the minute. It's not easy and effortless. I think we're all, again, in our research community on a learning curve about this. So occasionally the scripts that they run do kind of run haywire. This is one of the reasons we do text and data mining on a different platform than the platform that our human readers use, because we don't want to impinge on their service or slow their response times down. So you get the occasional hiccup, but most of the time it's fine.
Things that we have recently experienced at my own institution was canceling 3 big deal packages, not Elsevier's as it happens, and it was really a matter of a lack of budget flexibility and the difficulty in planning when your budget is carved up into enormous chunks that cannot be reduced in a time of budget difficulties. So we didn't save any money, but we at least did gain flexibility in the process of losing access to thousands of titles. So I guess one question I would have for you is, how do you see the big deal in Elsevier's future, and what relationship might there be between changing access models, such as open access, and the viability of package deals like the big deal?
So I'm sorry that you had to go through that exercise. It sounds really painful, actually. And thanks for keeping our big deal. That's kind of you. How do publishers think about it? We know libraries need flexibility. That's why we all tend to have big deal packages and subject collections, and you can buy by title, and you can purchase on demand as well through pay-per-view services and whatever. It's really our job to offer libraries choices. It sounds like you had to make some very difficult choices.
So the big deal, would you call it a preferred model for Elsevier, or does that not really matter?
No, in our view, it's the library's decision about the right way that it's comfortable for you to purchase. I suppose the advantage of the breadth of subject matter is that users, particularly interdisciplinary users or people browsing across new subject areas, might want to access and use materials that you wouldn't select for your collections, and I'm sure you're painfully aware of that as well. Yeah. So the broadest spectrum of content obviously is desirable, but that's not always.
It doesn't, in that sense, it doesn't really change Elsevier's view of how it will accomplish its own goals, whether libraries take big deal packages or others.
No. Our job is to offer flexible purchasing options. Now, you asked about open access in the big deal. I don't know how to answer that at this point. Some publishers are piloting and experimenting with combining the two through offsetting deals, for example, where maybe for an uplift, you get both your subscription access and your open access article publishing charges paid. We haven't piloted such a model yet, though we're in discussions and trying to look at how we can help libraries with the affordability challenges that come with maintaining subscription collections, and then also adding open access publishing fees on top of that.
What portion of Elsevier's titles are now open access?
All of them. So they all have green open access options, so self-archiving options. And then for the gold open access model, which is where articles can be funded through upfront article publishing charges, we have around 325 fully gold OA titles. We have over 1,600 hybrid titles. And there are, if I can do my maths then, that leaves about 500 titles, typically society-owned titles, that may not have gold OA publishing options at this point.
Okay, so it's the gold OA then, that in the sense that an open access title requires no subscription to access. It is those titles that really make big deals a difficult sell from a publisher to a library. So in that sense, the more gold open access there is in your portfolio, the less need there is for libraries to take these packages.
But counterintuitively, really counterintuitively, at least for us, I don't know if this is true for all publishers, but we're actually seeing our subscription content growing as the gold open access content is growing. The gold OA articles are growing faster, but from a very tiny base. Yes. But the counterintuitive part is that we're still launching subscription journals, and we're still seeing 3, 4, 5% growth in the volume of subscription articles. Okay. And I think a lot of librarians I talk to, a lot of researchers I talk to, assume that the gold open access publishing is substituting for the subscription content, and therefore the subscription prices will drop and the rest of it. In fact, it's just slowing the growth rate for subscription publishing.
Is it the hybrid, when you talk about the number of articles, is it because of hybrid journals that it is mixed, the growth and of open access and subscription?
So the reason it's growing is because internationally, governments around the world are actually continuing to invest in research, and that grows at around 4% every year. So the number of researchers is growing in countries like China and India and Brazil. Those researchers are all publishing articles. So the total volume is growing. And then from our perspective, it's the author's choice, whether they want to publish the open access model or the subscription model. Either way is cool with us. But they're both growing counterintuitively.
Okay. Well, speaking of open access, there's been a little bit of, I wouldn't call it a brouhaha, but there's the journal Lingua
a little frisson, I think.
Okay. I'll accept your. But it seems that the editorial board has resigned. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, and they're going to form their own journal.
That's right.
And evidently, it had to do with open access concerns, or. And again, I'd like you to address it from Elsevier's standpoint.
Okay. Well, I think the important thing is that we wish them well with their new journal. There's a little bit more to it. I think there was a suggestion made that the journal, which is over 60 years old, should be given to the editorial board members. And there was a philosophical belief that the journal should be owned in the research community. We publish with lots. We publish lots of journals in partnership with people in the research community, so
societies and so on.
Exactly, but I'm not aware of a model where individuals tend to own a journal. So anyway, that was an interesting twist. They also were quite keen that the title, which has very low gold OA uptake, even though it's a hybrid title, be flipped to fully gold open access, and with an article publishing charge of 400 euros, I think the suggestion was. And we didn't see any way to make that work.
When Elsevier is dealing with a society publication,
yes.
Is the society then, does the society continue to be in control of the editorial policy, or does that control lie elsewhere?
It can vary. I don't work personally with societies, but what I understand from my colleagues is that there are some of our society publishing partners who have very clear, strong views, and they're really actively engaged in the journal. There are others who make their decisions, but they like a lot of information and advice upon which to make those decisions. And then there's some that are very easy with a publisher partner being very hands-on.
So having entered into a relationship with Elsevier as a society publisher,
yes.
There is a degree to which there is an expectation they will surrender some of that decision-making about cost and who is in charge, because they're members of the Elsevier community, rather than completely independent.
So the way, my understanding is that the way most of the society publishing contracts work is that this is agreed up front. The society will actually go to tender, and publishers will compete for that business. And the tender document will lay out the expectations of the society, and then there's a formal agreement, how much we will pay them, etc. So that's all worked out up front. And I'm sure that there is chemistry between the society and the publisher and the editorial board, and so it might evolve from that contractual point, depending on the actual people involved. But it is very clearly set up front.
Okay. Actually, as you were talking, I wondered in my own mind, what will happen to Lingua now that the editorial board has moved on to other things? Will Elsevier get another society involved, or how will it maintain its viability?
Just to be really clear, Lingua isn't a society-owned title.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Actually, we own it, and have done for over 60 years. So Lingua will continue. We're still committed to publishing it. The current editorial board, their contracts go until the end of the year, it's my understanding, and then they'll move on to their new journal. And
so you'll just find some new editors to do the work.
That's right.
That's the market.
Well,
that's the market at work. Yeah.
And we wish them well. It's hard to start up a new journal. They've got some nice grant money to start up with, and
I was wondering if you could give us a heads up. You're going to be presenting tomorrow.
Yes.
With some folks from the University of Florida. Is that right? And you'll be talking about how you and the people at the University of Florida are trying to expand access to University of Florida authors' works that are.
Yes.
So could you, like I said, give us a little heads up about what you guys will be talking about?
But stop me when I get boring, because I love this project and I really get overly excited about it. So it's quite cool. We have got some new API-based services on Science Direct, and the University of Florida team have been able to pull into their institutional repository metadata records and abstracts for all of the articles that their employees have published with us back to, I think it's 1949. so around 30,000 article records, which immediately gives their IR a much stronger position to showcase the research outputs from the University of Florida. And then we're going a step further. We are using the APIs as well to link users from the repository over to Science Direct. Because what we find is that the vast majority of repository users, they're professional researchers, they'll be entitled to access the final version of the full text. And so we're able to get them access to the final version rather than to a locally stored manuscript, for example. And so come along if you're free.
And it seems to me that it enhances discovery because it's going to be on Science Direct, right? Is that the theory or the idea?
And the discovery can also happen in the repository as well, or through Google. All of these articles are well indexed and discoverable. It just means that the repository user, say it's a user from MIT who lands on the Florida repository, they're entitled to see the final version because of MIT's subscriptions. We'll get them to that final version rather than them looking at a locally hosted manuscript.
I see.
Does that make sense?
Yes. In other words, they might be seeing the final version and not a preprint or something.
Exactly.
At least
right.
the theory would be that
So
exactly
the
right.
only people then who would see the final version are those who can authenticate through a system that has that right. It is not everyone who sees the final version.
That's right. So unentitled users, or what we call guest users, would be presented with different access options. So we have rental options, and the University of Florida team want us also to prompt them with awareness that they might have interlibrary loan options or whatever. But most of the people that we find trying to access articles do have that access. They are entitled in some way, shape, or form. So we can get the users to the best available version.
And so this is sort of, these are green open access model of materials that are available to the public after an embargo period. And the one you're proposing then is that for those who have the right, they can access the final version rather than the version that's been deposited in the IR.
That's right. They could access the IR version if they're not entitled, if they're guest users. We're also now beginning to work with some of the U.S. federal funding agencies through the Course service. And so we're beginning to experiment with opening manuscripts on Science Direct as well. So there might be a public access option available that doesn't require the repository necessarily to locally host manuscripts.
What sort of manuscript are you talking about?
So an accepted manuscript has gone through peer review, and it has author-incorporated changes from the peer review process, but no publisher-introduced changes or formatting, pagination, that sort of thing. But the Florida team are so interesting. They're really thoughtful. I think when we started out, they were very interested in locally storing manuscripts. They've decided that that won't be their objective, actually, that it's a lot of hassle to chase down researchers and to coax the manuscripts out of them. We already have the full text, and so by linking and having the metadata held locally, it seems like a win-win-win. They don't have to bother their researchers. They can provide a showcasing service for Florida research outputs, and they can get users to the full text as well.
So regardless of the researcher's compliance with the Green OA requirements for deposit, they can still get access to the final version. Is that right?
So the Florida doesn't have any deposit requirements.
Okay. Although the funders often do.
Some funders do, that's true. And publishers often work with funders. So, for example, with NIH, we deposit manuscripts on behalf of authors. With the U.S. Department of Energy, we're working through Course. So we'll be opening manuscripts on the publisher's platform. and then prompting authors to do the self-archiving, but that's into the Department of Energy's repository, not into the Florida or another institutional repository. It is confusing, though. Everybody's got slightly different policies, and we all have to figure it out, don't we?
In the Florida instance, the full text, or at least a form of the full text, is in the repository.
In most cases not. They haven't had a lot of luck, I think, with getting their researchers to self-archive.
I see.
So they'll be relying really heavily on linking. I mentioned that we gave them 30,000 metadata records. I think, if the number is correct, they have seven locally hosted articles.
I see.
And that's all.
So regardless of the self-archiving activities, the access is there.
Exactly. So it's a really nice complement. It's a safety net. There's always some way for a user, any kind of user, to get to either the full text or access options around the full text.
And if someone has not taken up the gold or the green OA deposit, would anybody who's a guest have any access to that material? I think this is a little complicated, but let me try to answer. So for Elsevier, for Department of Energy, for articles reporting on Department of Energy research, after the embargo period, anybody would be able to now see manuscripts on our platforms. So a person doesn't need to deposit something in order for it to be deposited, because the publisher is taken care of.
I think that's overstated. That would be very provocative to some librarians and some institutional repository managers who may feel very passionate about locally hosting manuscripts. We're not preventing that. All of our authors have self-archiving options, but we do think these IR services, these APIs, might be more efficient and effective. But it's up to you guys to decide that, and we're really pleased to be piloting them with Florida and with other repositories. Okay. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. It's a very complicated...
It is.
It is, and I'm not sure I'm doing a very good job explaining it. I'm sorry.
That those of us who are actually part of this, the library profession, often find it kind of confusing to know where we stand in this whole procedure. It's not always clear what advantage we gain or lose in different options like this. So it's good to have some clarity about it.
Yeah. Just a pitch for the gold OA option, which doesn't get a lot of policy airtime here in the United States in particular, but it is, it's the approach to open access where everybody on the planet gets immediate access to the final version, and it seems a lot simpler actually than lots of different versions on different platforms and having to worry about which is opened when. And
I believe RC UK in Great Britain is mostly gold open access, right? Right,
with the green as a secondary enabling mechanism, and the Netherlands has that approach as well, but most other countries on the planet are green first. So anyway, whatever you all decide, we'll offer options, but it does sometimes seem that the gold approach is a little less messy. So we'll see.
And more costly, and I think that's probably the rub, right? I mean, it costs for the gold, whereas the green is theoretically free.
But the green isn't free because it piggybacks on your subscription spend. So if you think about it, in the subscription world, you're paying on the reader side, right? And in the gold OA world, you're paying on the author side.
The producer side, sure.
Yeah, the total systemic costs are the same. It doesn't really matter if you move the point of payment along. What changes is who bears what proportion of that total systemic cost. So actually the gold OA world isn't more expensive in total, but for research-intensive institutions and countries, it would be more expensive because they'd be producing more articles, and if they're paying on the author side, that means they would pick up a bigger proportion of the systemic cost.
So the costs are similar for a subscription-based model and the gold OA. I mean, they balance out. I guess my point was that the green OA, which is there's no costs or few costs involved, would be less expensive, and maybe that's why there hasn't been the uptake on the gold OA that you had anticipated or hoped for.
But let me just push back gently but firmly, because the green OA model doesn't work in isolation. The publishing costs for Green OA are recovered through the subscription model. So if the subscription model stops working, then there's no Green OA because there's no publishing.
I see.
So I think there's a widely held misunderstanding that Green OA is free or less expensive. Green OA is how you make a subscription article open access, and you do that by making a version freely available. And the reason there can be slightly complex rules about how to do Green OA is because publishers need to figure out how to be able to continue to sell subscriptions in parallel. That's why there are embargo periods and rules about which version you share. But the Green OA model is symbiotic with the subscription business model, which is how the system is funded. It can't operate in isolation or without that subscription model.
So in a sense, the extra infrastructure involved in institutional repositories and things like that could potentially make the whole system of Green OA more expensive to maintain.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Do you find that there is a widespread belief that Green OA is a cheaper or free model?
Yes, I think that's a widely held misunderstanding.
Yeah, that's interesting. Would you say that a model of Green OA has been adopted more in Europe than in the United States for any particular reason?
So Green OA is popular in the US and in Europe, and in Asia Pacific and in South America and in Africa. And I suspect it's because of this misunderstanding about costs. Gold OA has been adopted as the preference in the UK and the Netherlands. And sometimes I'm asked, oh, that's just because they have publishing companies there, you've influenced them. Actually, it's because they've worked really closely with us and other stakeholders, and they've had long processes of looking into the different models, and the stakeholders together have independently come up with the view that gold is preferable because of that immediate access to the final version, not because we have stitched up the process. I'm not sure that in other regions or in countries there's been as rigorous a process necessarily with an open mind about both models. But I'm sure that will come. It's complicated, it's changing, we're all learning as we go, we'll all figure it out. Just need to hang in there and work together.
Well, the more discussions we can have about these things, the better off we'll all be.
And Charleston's brilliant for that. Actually, this has been a really energizing conference because it's very inclusive, and there are lots of rational discussions about difficult things between librarians and publishers, and it's fantastic, really terrific.
Well, and I have had discussions before about the question of what model of open access is preferable. And I think one of the suggestions has been that gold open access is somewhat deceptive in the sense that many people would regard it as being, green open access. That green open access does not encourage a decrease in costs the way it is often believed to do, and that gold open access could be cheaper in the long run for institutions. And I do not believe that is commonly understood among people making decisions about these things.
That's absolutely right. And to support your point, which is spot on, the Max Planck Digital Library in Germany published what they call a radical proposal earlier this year. And they're really thinking through how you do a global switch from the subscription model Green OA to gold. And we've dug into their numbers. We think they underestimate the total systemic cost, right? But their point is right, that the total systemic cost would not be any greater in a fully gold OA world. The interesting thing, when we really got into their numbers, it looks like for the United States, the total contribution in a fully gold world would be less than your total contribution in the subscription world. But research-intensive institutions would bear a greater proportion of the costs.
Right.
So there's not been very much discussion here about it, and I think you're spot on. I don't know how to trigger more creative engagement with that, but it's interesting.
If you were doing this interview, what question would you ask yourself?
What's the most awkward question I could ask? That would be fun. You guys have been very gentlemanly.
It doesn't have to be awkward. It could be just, what question have we missed that we should have been asking? But awkward would be good.
Awkward would be
We could do both.
I'm just thinking randomly. A question I would like to be asked is about access in developing countries, if you don't mind.
Oh, you've been asked.
Thank you. Okay, so there is a lot of access to journal content and book content in the 106 least developed countries in the world because of this terrific program called Research for Life. And it's a partnership between United Nations agencies and libraries and publishers, where we provide free or really, really low-cost access. And I think that is widely unknown. A lot of researchers are concerned about peers in the developing world not having access. They have terrific access, or the possibility of it. There can be infrastructural problems for them. Maybe the electricity doesn't work, or the Wi-Fi is horrible, but the access is available there.
Alicia, we really appreciate you coming by.
Only because it's such a great conference with so much good content. So thank you both very much. It's an enjoyable talk.
Our pleasure.